It was 11:23 on a Thursday night in the middle of November when the storm finally broke open above the ridge. Not the kind of rain that builds slowly, the kind that arrives all at once, like a decision that has been put off too long. I had been sitting at the kitchen table since 9, blueprints rolled out flat, a cup of coffee going cold on my right, the overhead lamp pulling a yellow circle out of the dark around me. That was where I was. That was what I was doing when the knock came. 2 knocks, not 3, not 1, 2, measured, deliberate. The kind of knock that has already rehearsed itself 100 times on the drive over and still almost didn't make it to the door. I sat there for 1 full second before I moved. Because in 9 years of living alone at the end of Becker Lane, nobody had knocked on my door at 11:23 on a Thursday night in the middle of a November storm. Nobody. I crossed the hall, pulled the door open, and the wind came in before she did. She was standing at the edge of the porch light in a tan canvas jacket that had stopped being waterproof about 20 minutes ago. Dark hair plastered flat against the side of her face. One hand gripped the strap of a weekend bag hanging off her shoulder. The other hand was pressed flat to her sternum, not clutching anything, just pressed there, the way a person holds themselves together when they are running low on everything. She looked at me. I looked at her. She said 3 words. "Can I stay?" I did not answer right away. Not because I didn't know the answer, because I needed a second to understand what I was looking at. This was Claire Ashworth, my neighbor. The house with the blue shutters, 40 feet across the gravel road, divorced 11 months ago after a 7-year marriage. She had 2 daughters, 8 and 11. She kept a kitchen garden in the summer. She waved from her car every morning. We had spoken, really spoken, maybe 6 times in 4 years. 6 times. And she was on my porch at 11:23 at night with a bag on her shoulder and her hand pressed to her chest, asking if she could stay. I stepped back from the door. "Come inside." The porch light caught the water running off the end of her jacket as she came past me. "My name is Owen Garrett. I am 41 years old. I am a civil engineer. I work alone out of the back office of this house on bridge load assessments and drainage planning for municipal contracts. I tell you that because it matters. A man who spends his days calculating stress tolerances and load distribution develops a particular habit of mind. He learns to read what a structure is actually doing, not what it looks like from the road. He learns that the cracks that will bring a building down are almost never the visible ones. Before I tell you what happened after Claire stepped through that door, you need to understand who I was before she knocked. I need you to understand why a woman like her, with a situation like hers, on a night like that, chose this particular house. My father was a bridge inspector for the state of Virginia for 31 years. He died of lung cancer when I was 24. He was a quiet man who communicated in the language of things done correctly. He never told me he loved me in words. He showed me by teaching me how to splice a wire, how to read a topographic map, how to hold a level. I learned the word enough from my father. Enough means the structure stands. Enough means the joint holds. Enough means you did the work honestly and you can look at it in the morning. I studied civil engineering at Virginia Tech. I graduated with no ceremony because my father was in the hospital the week of commencement, and I sat with him instead. That was the right call. I never questioned it. I moved to Hayden County 12 years ago for a state infrastructure contract that extended twice and then became my whole life. I bought the house on Becker Lane because it needed work and because it was at the end of a road that didn't ask anything of me when I came home at night. I poured the new foundation myself the first summer. I re-ran the plumbing the second year. I replaced every window the third. The house was mine in the way things are yours when you have held them together with your own hands. I was married once. Her name was Karen. We were together 5 years, married for 3 of them.
She was a hospital administrator, organized, precise, professionally warm in the way some people are warm with everyone, which is another way of saying warm with no one in particular. We were compatible in the ways that look like enough on paper. We wanted the same things in the abstract. What we did not have, I only understood after she left, was the specific thing, the unrepeatable thing, the thing that isn't in any of the categories people talk about when they talk about relationships.
She said she felt like she had brought her weather into my house. I thought about that for a moment. Then I told her that this house had been through a lot of weather. It was built for it. She didn't answer, but I watched her shoulders drop about a quarter inch. Sometimes that's the whole conversation. I was up at 6. I had made coffee and put a plate of toast on the table before I heard her moving in the guest room. She came out at 6:30 with her hair pulled back and her jacket folded over her arm, clearly prepared to make an exit. She stopped when she saw the table. She looked at me. I gestured at the chair. She sat down. We ate toast and drank coffee and talked about almost nothing. The storm had cleared overnight. The light coming through the kitchen window was the sharp, clean kind that only comes after a hard rain. She told me about her girls. Emma, who was 11 and wanted to be a marine biologist. Laurel, who was 8 and had decided at some point in the past year that silence was a form of power and deployed it strategically. I told her about a bridge I had assessed the previous spring, a 19th century stone arch over Dry Creek, and how the original builders had made a calculation error in the eastern pier that had been quietly compensating for itself for 140 years. She asked how a structure compensates for a calculation error. I told her it distributes the load differently than designed. It works harder in places it wasn't supposed to, often for longer than anything built correctly would have lasted. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds familiar." I did not ask what she meant. I think we both knew. She left at 7:40. She said thank you at the door with the kind of directness that some people use when they are not good at the softer version. I told her the house was here if the power didn't come back. She nodded and walked across the gravel to the blue shutters. I went back to the drainage report, but I left the guest room door open, which I never do. I did not examine why at the time. The power came back to her side of the road by noon. I know because I saw her kitchen light go on from my office window. She waved from the back door, one hand raised. I raised mine. That was all. But it was a different kind of wave than the morning ones from the car. There was something in it that had not been there before. Something that happens between two people when one of them has been cold and the other one has offered warmth, and neither of them has made it into more than it was. That kind of simple, honest exchange changes the quality of the space between people. I noticed it. I did not say anything about it because there was nothing to say. I just noticed it and filed it the way I file structural data. Observed, held, not yet interpreted. 3 days later, she was at my door again. This time at 4 in the afternoon, no storm, no bag, no emergency. She had a covered dish in her hands, and she told me it was lentil soup, and that she had made too much. I told her to come in. She set the soup on the counter and looked around the kitchen the way people do when they are really looking, not just politely orienting. She noticed the blueprints on the table. She asked about them. I explained the project. She asked 2 good questions. Not the polite kind people ask to fill a pause, but the kind that come from actually processing what you just said. She stayed for an hour and a half. She left and said she hoped the soup was all right. I told her it was excellent. It was. She came back the following Tuesday with her older daughter, Emma, who had a school project about structural engineering that was due in 4 days and was, according to Emma herself, not going well. I sat with Emma at the kitchen table for 2 hours. I explained load-bearing walls using a cardboard box and a stack of books. I explained compression and tension using a piece of string and my coffee mug. Emma was quiet and careful, the way some 11-year-olds are when they are actually interested in something and don't want to admit it in case the interest goes away. When she finally got it, when the concept clicked, she looked up from the table with the particular expression of a person who has just understood something they had assumed they would never understand. I recognized that expression. It is the same one I had the first time I read a topographic map and understood what the contour lines were actually saying. Claire was sitting at the far end of the table with a book she wasn't reading. When Emma looked up, Claire looked up too. She caught my eye over the top of Emma's head. She did not smile, not exactly. There was something quieter than a smile. The look of a person who is watching something good happen and is allowing themselves to be glad about it without turning it into a declaration. Emma got an A- on the project. She told me 3 weeks later, standing at my door with the paper in her hand, like evidence. I told her the minus meant there was still something to learn. She considered this for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Yeah, okay," and walked back across the gravel with the paper tucked under her arm. Claire was standing in her doorway, watching. She looked at me and shook her head slightly, one of those small movements that means several things at once. This time, I did smile. November became December. The visits did not follow a schedule. They did not announce themselves. They accumulated the way certain things accumulate when no one is forcing them, when both people have simply stopped pretending not to want them. A plate of something on a Tuesday. A question about a calculation on a Thursday. An afternoon when Emma and Laurel were both there and the house had a different quality of noise in it than I had ever allowed myself to want. Laurel, the 8-year-old strategist, had decided by the 3rd visit that I was acceptable. I knew this because she stopped testing me. For the first 2 visits, she had asked me questions that had no right answer, the kind children ask when they are trying to find the edges of a person. I had answered all of them plainly and without performance. On the 3rd visit, she sat next to me at the kitchen table and showed me a drawing she had made of a horse and asked me if it looked like a horse. I told her the proportion of the legs to the body was accurate for a trotting position and that the shading on the mane showed good instinct. She looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she said, "Nobody ever told me that." Then she put the drawing back in her folder and ate her soup without comment. Claire was watching from across the table. She looked down at her bowl quickly when I glanced over, but not before I saw it. The color that had come up in her face. The particular color that comes from watching someone handle your child with care when they didn't have to. One evening in mid-December, after the girls had gone home and it was just the 2 of us finishing the last of a pot of tea at my kitchen table, she told me about Marcus, not the custody arrangement. She told me about the marriage. She told me about the 7 years of it. She told me that she had been very good at managing the surface of it, and that she had spent so many years managing the surface that she had one day looked up and understood that there was nothing underneath. Not a disaster, not a betrayal, just a long, slow recognition that 2 people had built a life together without ever asking whether they were the right 2 people. She said the hardest thing about the divorce was not the loss of the marriage. It was the loss of the story she had told herself about who she was in it. I listened. I did not offer the version of comfort that is really just impatience. I did not say it would get better, which is what people say when they want you to hurry up and be finished with the hard part so they can be comfortable again. I just listened until she was done, and when she was done, she sat back in her chair and looked at the table for a while. Then she looked up. "Thank you for not saying the obvious thing," she said. I told her I generally tried to only say the true thing. She smiled. Then she said, "You know, you're considerably easier to talk to than you look like you're going to be." She thought about it. She said, I looked like a person who had solved most things and wasn't particularly interested in discussing the ones he hadn't. I thought about that for a while. I told her she was mostly right, but that I had gotten lonelier about it than I had intended. She did not immediately respond. She just looked at me in the way that means a person has heard something and is deciding whether to acknowledge it or let it sit. She let it sit, but she didn't look away. The custody hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of January. As it got closer, Claire got quieter, not cold, just inward. The way structures get just before a load change, when everything is calculating and holding. I did not push. I did not volunteer comfort she hadn't asked for, but I made sure the kettle was on when she came by. I made sure the table was clear. I made sure that when she wanted to talk, there was a space for it, and that when she didn't, I was doing something at my desk that didn't require anything from her. The night before the hearing, she came over at 8. She didn't have a dish, didn't have the girls. She had her coat on over what was clearly pajamas, the same combination as that first November night, and she stood in my doorway with both hands in her pockets and said she just needed to not be alone in her house tonight. I stepped back from the door. The kitchen light was on. I had been reading. I put the kettle on. We sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight. We talked about the bridge over Dry Creek. We talked about Emma's next project. We talked about Laurel's horse drawing, which Laurel had apparently framed and hung in her bedroom, a fact which Claire mentioned very carefully, as if she was placing something fragile on a shelf and wasn't sure yet if the shelf would hold the weight of it. I drove her home at midnight because the temperature had dropped and the gravel road was iced over. She got out of the truck and stood at her door for a moment. Then she turned back. "Owen, yeah, I'm glad it was your house." I sat in the truck for a minute after her door closed. The yard light was on over her porch. I could see the blue shutters, dark against the winter dark, and the kitchen window, and the shape of her passing behind the glass. I drove back across 40 feet of gravel and went inside. The house felt the same way it had the morning after that first night. Like something had quietly shifted in the load-bearing structure, like the weight was distributed differently than it had been before, and the building was adjusting, finding its new equilibrium, doing its honest engineering work without being asked. The hearing went well. Not perfectly, not all at once, but well. The primary residence arrangement held. The mediation would continue, but the immediate motion was resolved. She knocked on my door that evening with Emma and Laurel and a pizza box, and a look on her face that I can only describe as a person returning from somewhere she had been afraid she might not get back from. We ate pizza at the kitchen table. Laurel showed me a new drawing, this time a dog. I told her the musculature around the hindquarters showed significant improvement from the horse. Emma asked if I would explain suspension bridges at some point because she had decided to do an extra credit project. I told her yes. Claire sat across the table and said almost nothing for most of the meal, but twice, when she thought I wasn't watching, I caught her looking at me the way you look at something you have decided to trust. Not completely, not without reservation. The way you look at a structure that has held weight when it needed to and has earned the right to hold more. January moved into February. The visits became less occasional and more regular without anyone deciding they would be. The girls started leaving things at my house. Emma's book about ocean currents, open face down on the side table, Laurel's crayons in the kitchen drawer, the drawer I had cleared out at some point without mentioning it. Claire started making coffee here on Saturday mornings. Not asking, not announcing, just arriving at 8:30 and knowing where the beans were, which she had learned by watching, and making it the way I made it, which I noticed and did not comment on, because commenting would have made it a declaration, and it was not yet ready to be a declaration. It was still building. One Saturday in February, she asked me the question I had been sitting with since November. She asked it plainly, the way she had said most things, without softening it in advance or building toward it. She said, "What do you actually want, Owen? Not right now. From a life." I thought about it the way I think about structural problems. I said I wanted enough. She asked what enough meant. I told her about my father. about the word the way he had used it. Enough means the structure stands. Enough means you did the work honestly and you can look at it in the morning. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, I think I wanted spectacular for a long time. I thought a marriage was supposed to feel like a constant fireworks show. And when it didn't, when it started feeling like something you had to tend and maintain and negotiate, I took that as evidence that something was wrong. I think maybe the tending is the thing. I think maybe spectacular is what the tending builds into. Over time, if you stay. I didn't say anything for a moment. The coffee was still hot. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle it comes in February, low and direct, landing across the table. Her hands were wrapped around her mug. She was looking at the table. Then she looked up. I think what I want is something that holds, she said, something you can look at in the morning. I set my mug down. I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, that's a thing I know how to build. She held my eyes. Something shifted. Not dramatically, not the way the movies have it. More like the final settling sound a foundation makes when it has found the position it will hold. A sound you almost don't hear. A sound you only recognize if you have been listening for it. We did not make any announcements. We did not reclassify anything with language. We just sat there in the February morning light with our coffee and the sense of something settled between us that had not been settled before. The girls knew before we told them. Emma asked me at breakfast one Saturday in March, with the directness of an 11-year-old who has already decided not to waste time on a preamble, whether I was going to be around. I told her that was the plan. She nodded once, went back to her eggs. Laurel did not ask a question. She just moved her crayons from the kitchen drawer to the shelf in the living room, the low one she could reach, as if she had evaluated the situation and determined that a more permanent arrangement was warranted. I left them there. I did not mention it to Claire. She noticed 2 days later. She stood at the shelf for a moment, looking at the crayons, and then she looked at me across the room. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything, but something passed between us. One of those long, specific looks that carries more than language can hold. The kind of look that means, I see what is being built here, I see it too, and I'm not going to rush it, and I am not going to pretend it isn't happening, and that is the whole of it. It is March now. The snow has been gone for 2 weeks. The kitchen garden across the gravel road is still under its winter cover, but Claire is already making plans for it. She showed me the layout on paper last Tuesday. I suggested moving the drainage line on the east side to account for the slope. She considered this and agreed and wrote it in the margin without making a thing of it. That is a detail. But details are where the honest work happens. Emma has started her suspension bridge project. She comes over on Thursday afternoons and we work at the kitchen table. Laurel sometimes sits with us and draws. The house has a different quality now than it did in November. Still mine. Still quiet in the specific way I need it to be, but inhabited now in a way it has not been before. Not just physically occupied, inhabited in the way a house becomes when the people in it have decided to be in it on purpose. I used to think enough meant absence. Enough stress on the structure. Enough noise in the room. Enough demands on the load. I managed my life to minimize the variables because I had learned that variables were where failure happened. What I know now is that I was confusing stability with emptiness. A structure that is completely isolated from load becomes brittle over time. It stops knowing how to flex. It forgets that its whole purpose is to hold something. Claire knocked on my door with a bag on her shoulder and her hand pressed to her chest, and 3 words that could have been a question or a request or just the last thing she had the energy to say. Can I stay? She was asking about that night. She was only asking about that night, but the answer I gave without knowing I was giving it was yes. Not just until morning, not just through the storm. I stepped back from the door. I made the tea. I left the guest room open. I made a room in the structure for the load that was coming. and I found that the load was not too much, that it was in fact the specific load the structure had been built to carry all along and had simply never been asked to. There is a kind of person who comes into your life without announcement, without spectacle. They knock twice, not 3 times, and they ask a small question that turns out not to be a small question at all. They stay for one night, and then they stay for Tuesday, and then they are in your kitchen on Saturday morning, knowing where the coffee beans are, and they are on the living room shelf with their daughter's crayons, and they are at your table with a drainage map asking the right questions in the right order. And somewhere in all of that, without any one moment being the moment, your house becomes inhabited again. Your structure finds its load. You look at it in the morning and you know the work was done honestly. You know the joint holds. I used to think a quiet life was a life without weather. I know now it is a life with a house built well enough to stand in the storm and a door you are willing to open when someone knocks at 11:23 in November with nothing left but 3 words and the faith that you might be the kind of person who steps back instead of forward. I was that person. I did not know I was until I was standing in my doorway with the rain blowing sideways and a woman pressing her hand to her chest across the threshold. I stepped back. She came in. That was all it was. That is all it needed to be. There is a kind of courage that does not announce itself. The courage of a person who packs a bag in the dark and crosses 40 feet of gravel road in a November storm and knocks on a door belonging to someone they have only really spoken to 6 times in 4 years. That is a quiet kind of brave. It does not look like bravery. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like a woman pressing her hand to her chest and using the last of what she has to say 3 words. And there is a courage on the other side of the door, too. The courage of a person who has learned to live with very little and who opens the door anyway, who makes the tea, who moves to the couch, who leaves the guest room open and the kettle ready and does not ask for anything in return and does not make the kindness into something more than it is until it has earned the right to be more. The coming back has to be a decision, not a default. The warmth has to be real, not performed. Both of those things are acts of trust. Both of them are harder than they look. The storm that knocked out Claire's power on that Thursday in November also knocked out mine for about 4 hours the following morning. I worked by lamplight until it came back. I did not mind. The lamp my father had given me when I moved into this house threw a warm circle across the kitchen table, and the blueprints were still there, and the coffee was still good, and the guest room door was still open, and something in the house had changed its quality overnight. It was still mine. It was also quietly beginning to be ours. If this story found you tonight, I want to leave you with 2 questions. Have you ever opened a door in a storm and found the thing on the other side was exactly the weight you had been built to carry but had never been asked to? Or have you ever stood on someone else's porch in the dark and asked for one night and meant something longer that you weren't ready to say yet? Both sides of that door are stories worth telling. Leave yours below. I read every one of them. Hit the like button if this reached somewhere real, and subscribe for next week's story. Were you the one who knocked, or were you the one who stepped back?